The European Commission has made a youth mobility scheme a key demand amid Keir Starmer's post-Brexit reset with Brussels after years of tense relations under successive Conservative administrations. The proposal would likely mirror similar arrangements Britain already has with countries including Australia and Japan, and would perhaps allow 18 to 35-year-olds to move and work freely between countries for up to 2 years, say. Home Secretary Yvette Cooper has come out in staunch opposition to such a scheme.
So no youth mobility scheme.
That's not the right starting point for us at all.
But why? Having robbed our youth of the freedoms we ourselves enjoyed whilst a member of the European Union, surely a youth mobility scheme is the very least we can give back to them.
You see a point where you look at the numbers and you think, look, this is actually politically acceptable now to say, yes, Germany and France and Italy, let's have a youth mobility scheme so that young people can move between the UK and the EU.
We don't think this is the right approach. I understand from the EU point of view, they see this in the context of free movement. But the UK voted to leave free movement. We are not going back into free movement in the same way that we've said as part of
what's being proposed, of course, they say is not free movement. But you're saying there is no way.
They are seeing this in the context of their free movement. And I understand that. That's for the EU to decide. But the UK has left free movement. We made a decision to do that. We're not going back into that, and we did make that very clear as part of the manifesto.
But what the Home Secretary appears to be doing here is deliberately conflating a youth mobility scheme with a return to freedom of movement in order to justify the government's position that such a scheme would cross its Brexit red lines.
The UK voted to leave free movement. We are not going back into free movement.
But as the Home Secretary knows, the proposal for a youth mobility scheme falls far short of freedom of movement because it only allows individuals to come for a limited period of time and does not allow them to settle in the UK or EU member state. Here's more on this from Liberal Democrat MP and Chair of the Health and Social Care Select Committee, Layla Moran.
That is, first of all, absolutely not freedom of movement. It's under 30s only. They come and then they go back. And secondly, this is in our interests too. It's not that we're suddenly going to be flooded by young European people who can be baristas and bartenders, which frankly would be welcome in my local pubs because they've closed as a result. But actually it's for opportunities, particularly for young people from poorer backgrounds. It was those young people who were the most affected by this. The richer ones, frankly, could go and do their sort of European tour and gap years and whatever anyway. It was the ones who didn't have the money who benefited most from schemes like Erasmus.
As the Chair of the Health and Social Care Select Committee correctly points out, a youth mobility scheme is not a return to freedom of movement.
We do not have plans for the youth mobility scheme.
To justify his government's position that a youth mobility scheme would cross one of its Brexit red lines, the Prime Minister has also sought to conflate such a scheme with freedom of movement.
I hear his response on not rejoining the political structures, but as a specific measure to improve the opportunities for young people, will he open talks with the European Union on a youth mobility scheme?
On the substance of his question, look, we're not returning to freedom of movement, but I do understand the desire of people to work in other countries. But look, I need to be clear, there's no rejoining the EU, there's no rejoining the single market or the customs union or return to freedom of movement.
In recent weeks, the Prime Minister appears to have doubled down on his position.
But what I just don't understand is that he's ruled out negotiating a youth mobility scheme with our European partners. This could be so good for young people, for businesses, and for re-establishing that relationship. So will he reconsider this?
In our manifesto, we had clear red lines about the single market, customs union, freedom of movement, and we will negotiate with those red lines in place.
This deliberate conflation of a youth mobility scheme with a return to freedom of movement in order to justify the government's position such a scheme would cross its Brexit red lines. It's not just infuriating, it's just plain wrong. A youth mobility scheme is not a return to freedom of movement, so it doesn't cross the government's red lines on Brexit. Even former Brexit Minister Steve Baker says he's personally in favour of an EU youth mobility scheme with the UK.
You think it's a good idea?
Just as I made that apology to Ireland, talked about humility on their interest, resolve on our own, and I was able to do it because I was a Brexiteer. But similarly, on the young people moving to and fro, as long as it's time limited, as long as they're not here forever, as long as they come and go back, as long as there's a cap on numbers, I'm all in favour. It would be a gesture of goodwill. It would be a blip in the inflation numbers, but not a huge one compared to the other figures. And I'm afraid this is one where you've got to be a Brexiteer to say it's a good idea, because otherwise people are outdoing one another to be Brexiteer than Nigel Farage.
It's time the government stopped deliberately conflating a youth mobility scheme with a return to freedom of movement in order to justify its position such a scheme would cross its Brexit red lines. It won't, and the government knows it. And UK news shows need to start pointing this out. It's time the government put the country's youth before its fear of upsetting the right-wing press. Let's give something back to our young who've suffered so much in recent years. A youth mobility scheme will enable all our youth to travel and experience different cultures, not just the wealthy. It will enable young people to make friends and connections with people from other countries, develop skills and knowledge, and build international ties. This should be a no-brainer for any government. A youth mobility scheme won't just open doors for our youth. It'll foster cultural exchange, build trust between nations, and help to rebuild a UK-EU relationship that will drive economic growth and bolster security. And isn't that exactly what the government pledged to do in its manifesto?